While I was attending a legal conference in Chicago, my stepfather Scott called, his voice dripping with false confidence. "Margaret, I've liquidated your mother's trust fund to cover some urgent financial obligations," he announced smugly. "It's for the greater good. Mine." I calmly replied, "I hope that works out for you, Scott."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
He didn't understand my composed reaction at that moment. What he didn't know was that my husband Chandler wasn't just any lawyer, he was a federal judge. And when I returned home, Scott would discover that stealing from a federal judge's wife carries consequences he never imagined. The inheritance he thought he'd stolen was about to become the evidence that would destroy him. The phone call came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right in the middle of the National Legal Conference's keynote address on judicial ethics. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I stepped out of the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I found a quiet alcove near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking State Street. "Margaret," Scott's voice came through the speaker with that particular blend of arrogance and false familiarity I'd come to despise over the years. "I hope you're sitting down, sweetheart." The condescending endearment made my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. "What is it, Scott?" "Well, you know how I've been struggling with some cash flow issues lately," he began, and I could practically hear the smirk in his voice. "That business venture with the restaurant chain didn't quite pan out the way I expected. Lost a considerable amount of money, actually." I said nothing, watching the bustling Chicago street below. Pedestrians hurried past in their winter coats, each absorbed in their own lives, unaware that several floors above them, a man was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. "Anyway," Scott continued, his tone growing more confident, "I've found a solution to my little predicament. I've liquidated your mother's trust fund. You know, the one she set up for you before she passed. Transferred all of it into my accounts to cover the restaurant debts and get me back on solid ground." The words hung in the air like smoke from a extinguished candle. Around me, the muffled sounds of the conference continued, lawyers and judges discussing precedents and procedures, the very foundations of justice that Scott had just trampled on without a second thought. "The whole trust?" I asked quietly, my voice betraying nothing of the storm building inside me. "Every penny," he confirmed, and I could hear him settling back into what I imagined was his leather armchair, the one my mother had bought him during their brief marriage. "Look, Margaret, I know this might come as a shock, but it's for the greater good. Your mother would have wanted me to be financially stable. She always said family comes first, and I'm still family, aren't I?" The manipulation was so transparent, so perfectly Scott, that I almost laughed. He had perfected this routine over the years. Take what wasn't his, then wrap it in a bow of twisted logic and emotional blackmail. "Besides," he continued, his voice taking on that jovial tone he used when he thought he'd won, "it's not like you need the money. You're married to that judge of yours, living in that fancy house in Westfield. You've got everything you could want. This money will do more good, helping me get back on my feet." I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was my mother's final gift, her way of ensuring I'd always have something that was purely mine. She'd established it during the last months of her life, when she'd finally seen Scott for what he truly was. Too late to save herself, but not too late to protect me. The fund contained $800,000, not life-changing money for someone in my position, but significant enough. More importantly, it contained the proceeds from the sale of my grandmother's estate in Beacon Hill, including her collection of rare first-edition books and antique jewelry that had been in our family for 4 generations. My mother had liquidated everything and placed it in an irrevocable trust with very specific conditions. Conditions that Scott had just violated. "I know what you're thinking," Scott said, misreading my silence for shock or distress. You're wondering if this is legal, if I had the right. Well, sweetheart, I've got some news for you. When your mother married me, I became her legal heir. And when she died, that made me the executor of her estate, including any trusts or funds she established. He paused, clearly savoring what he thought was his moment of triumph. I've already spoken with my lawyer, Jerry Everett. You remember him from the wedding. He assured me that everything is perfectly legitimate. The paperwork's been filed, the transfers are complete. It's done, Margaret. It's for the best. I opened my eyes, staring out at the Chicago skyline. The afternoon sun caught the glass facades of the surrounding buildings, creating a kaleidoscope of reflected light. For a moment, I felt oddly peaceful, like standing in the eye of a hurricane. I see, I said simply. I know it's a lot to process, Scott continued, his voice taking on a mock sympathetic tone, but try to see it from my perspective. I've been struggling, really struggling. The restaurant debts, the mortgage on the house, the car payments, it was all mounting up. Your mother's money is going to save me from bankruptcy. She would have wanted that, don't you think? And you've already moved the funds? This morning, he confirmed proudly, transferred the whole amount into my personal accounts. I'm meeting with my creditors tomorrow to settle everything. Fresh start, clean slate. It's going to change everything for me. I nodded slowly, though he couldn't see me. I hope that works out for you, Scott. The silence that followed was telling. He'd clearly expected tears, anger, threats of legal action. He'd prepared for a fight, armed himself with justifications and legal technicalities. What he hadn't prepared for was calm acceptance. Well, good, he said finally, his voice losing some of its confidence. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Your mother always said you were the smart one in the family. She did say that, I agreed quietly. So we're good then? No hard feelings? I could picture him in that moment, leaning forward in his chair, his weathered face creased with confusion and growing unease. Scott had built his entire approach to life around provoking emotional reactions, feeding off the chaos he created. My composure was clearly unsettling him. No hard feelings, I confirmed. Right. Well, good. He cleared his throat. I should probably let you get back to your conference thing. Important lawyer business and all that. Judge business, actually, I corrected gently. Chandler's giving the closing address tomorrow on federal judicial oversight. Right, federal judge, fancy stuff. His voice carried a note of dismissive bitterness that I'd heard countless times before. Scott had always resented Chandler's success, his position, his integrity, everything Scott would never be. I'll see you when I get back, Scott. Sure thing, sweetheart. And Margaret, thanks for understanding. This really is for the best. The line went dead, leaving me standing in the alcove with the phone still pressed to my ear. Around me, the conference continued its measured pace, brilliant legal minds discussing the intricacies of justice, the importance of precedent, the sacred nature of the law. I slipped the phone back into my purse and returned to the ballroom, taking my seat just as the speaker was concluding his remarks on fiduciary responsibility. The irony was almost poetic. Scott thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the system, manipulated his way to financial salvation at my expense. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that he hadn't just stolen money from me. He had stolen from the wife of a federal judge, and that, as he was about to discover, was a very different kind of mistake altogether. The keynote speaker's words about fiduciary responsibility echoed in my ears as I sat in the ornate ballroom, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Around me, 300 of the country's most prominent legal professionals hung on every word about ethical obligations and the sacred trust between institutions and individuals. If they only knew what had just transpired in the hallway outside. I should have been furious. I should have been on the phone with my own attorney, demanding immediate action, threatening Scott with every legal remedy available. That's certainly what he expected, what he was probably preparing for at this very moment, rehearsing his justifications and rallying his meager defenses.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Instead, I felt something else entirely. A quiet, crystalline certainty that settled in my chest like cool water. Scott had just handed me everything I needed to destroy him, wrapped in a bow of his own arrogance. The speaker concluded his address to thunderous applause, and as the audience began to disperse for the afternoon networking session, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Evelyn Michaels, a federal prosecutor from the Southern District of New York and one of my closest friends from law school. "Margaret, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her sharp eyes studying my face with the practiced intensity of someone who made her living reading people. "Everything all right?" I smiled, the expression coming more easily than it should have under the circumstances. "Just received some interesting news from home." Evelyn's eyebrows rose slightly. After 15 years of friendship, she could read my moods better than most. Interesting good or interesting problematic?
Interesting, illuminating, I replied, standing and smoothing my navy suit jacket. Evelyn, remind me, what's the federal statute of limitations on wire fraud involving trusts and estates? Her expression sharpened immediately, prosecutor instincts kicking in. 5 years from the discovery of the offense. Why? Margaret, what's happened? My stepfather just called to inform me that he's liquidated my mother's trust fund without authorization, I said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Transferred $800,000 into his personal accounts this morning. Evelyn's mouth fell open slightly. What? Margaret, that's wire fraud, yes, among other things. I glanced around the opulent ballroom, watching clusters of legal professionals engaged in animated discussions about justice and procedure. He seems to believe that his status as my mother's former husband gives him some sort of legal authority over assets she placed in an irrevocable trust. "Please tell me you're not planning to handle this quietly," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Margaret, this is serious. This is federal." I turned to face her fully, and something in my expression must have conveyed my state of mind, because her concern shifted to something closer to anticipation. "Do you remember Jerry Everett?" I asked. Evelyn frowned, thinking, the name sounds familiar. Small-time attorney from Connecticut, handles mostly real estate transactions and simple wills. Scott mentioned that Jerry assured him the transfer was perfectly legitimate. "Oh no," Evelyn breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Margaret, please don't tell me." Jerry Everett has been suspended from practice twice for ethics violations, once for commingling client funds, once for providing legal advice outside his area of competence. I picked up my conference materials from the table, organizing them with methodical precision. He's also currently under investigation by the state bar for allegedly advising clients on federal tax strategies without proper certification. Evelyn stared at me. "How do you know all this?" Chandler mentioned him last month. Apparently, Jerry tried to file a motion in federal court using outdated precedents and incorrect statutory citations. Made quite an impression on the clerk's office. I slipped my materials into my briefcase, every movement deliberate and controlled. Chandler said it was some of the most incompetent legal work he'd seen in years. "So Scott's attorney is—" Evelyn began, "completely unqualified to handle trust and estate law, particularly at the federal level," I finished. "Which means every piece of advice he gave Scott, every assurance about the legality of the transfer, every document he filed." I let the implications hang in the air. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Your stepfather just committed federal wire fraud based on advice from an incompetent attorney who's under investigation for ethics violations. That's one way to put it." "Margaret," Evelyn gripped my arm gently. "This could destroy him, completely. Federal wire fraud carries up to 20 years, especially with amounts over $500,000. Add in the interstate nature of the transfers, potential tax implications, violation of fiduciary duty." She paused, studying my face again. "You know this, don't you? You know exactly what you're dealing with here." I nodded slowly.
Scott has always had a gift for overestimating his own cleverness. He sees a federal judge's wife and thinks, privileged woman with no real understanding of the law. He doesn't see someone who graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, who spent 5 years as a federal prosecutor before moving into private practice. He has no idea who he's dealing with, Evelyn said softly. None whatsoever. I closed my briefcase with a soft click. He called me sweetheart 3 times during our conversation, told me not to worry about the legal technicalities because he'd taken care of everything with his lawyer. Evelyn winced. The arrogance is almost impressive. We began walking toward the ballroom exit, our heels clicking in synchrony against the marble floor. Around us, conversations about legal theory and judicial philosophy continued, creating a backdrop of intellectual discourse that seemed almost surreal given what I'd just learned. "What's your next move?" Evelyn asked as we reached the ornate lobby. I paused at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking State Street, watching the afternoon crowd hurry past below. The December air looked crisp and biting, the kind of cold that clarified everything it touched. "I'm going to finish the conference," I said finally, "attend Chandler's presentation tomorrow, participate in the closing ceremonies, maintain my professional obligations. And then?" I turned to meet her gaze, and for the first time since Scott's call, I allowed myself a small, genuine smile. "Then I'm going home to have a very interesting conversation with my husband about his docket for next month." Evelyn's eyes widened as the full implication hit her. "Margaret, you can't mean—" "I don't mean anything," I interrupted gently. "I'm simply a citizen who's discovered that a federal crime has been committed against her. It's my civic duty to report it to the appropriate authorities." "And if those authorities happen to include your federal judge husband?" "Well," I said, my voice taking on the same mock-innocent tones Scott had used with me, "that's just a happy coincidence, isn't it?" That evening, I sat alone in my hotel room at the Palmer House, room service untouched on the mahogany table beside me. The city lights of Chicago sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but my mind was thousands of miles away, drifting back to a small hospital room in Hartford where my mother, Evelyn Phillips, had spent her final weeks. It was there, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the constant hum of medical equipment, that she had made the decision that would ultimately expose Scott's true nature, though neither of us knew it at the time. "Margaret," she had whispered one Tuesday afternoon in October, her voice barely audible above the oxygen machine. Her once vibrant auburn hair had thinned to wispy strands against the white pillowcase, but her green eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had carried her through 30 years as a mathematics professor at Wesleyan University. I had leaned closer, taking her fragile hand in mine. The engagement ring Scott had given her, a modest solitaire that seemed to grow smaller each day, caught the afternoon light streaming through the hospital window. "I need to tell you about the trust," she had continued, glancing toward the door to ensure Scott wasn't hovering nearby. He had been making himself scarce lately, I'd noticed. The reality of terminal illness seemed to make him uncomfortable, as if her mortality was an inconvenience he couldn't charm his way around. "What trust, Mom?" She had reached into the drawer of her bedside table with trembling fingers, retrieving a thick manila envelope sealed with her initials. "I've been working with Leonard Gill at Hartford Trust and Estate for the past 6 months. Everything from your grandmother's estate, the Beacon Hill property, her book collection, the jewelry, the investment accounts, it's all been liquidated and placed in an irrevocable trust." I had stared at the envelope, not fully understanding. "But Mom, you don't need to worry about that now. You should focus on getting better." A sad smile had crossed her lips. "Sweet girl, we both know I'm not getting better, and that's exactly why I need to worry about this now." She had pressed the envelope into my hands. "This trust is for you, Margaret. Only you. It's structured so that no one else can access it, modify it, or revoke it, not even me once the papers are filed." "What about Scott?" I had asked, though something in her expression already suggested the answer. "Scott will be taken care of," she had said carefully. The life insurance policy will cover the house and his immediate needs. But this, she had tapped the envelope with one finger, this is your grandmother's legacy, your education fund, your security. This is what our family built over generations, and I won't let it disappear into his business ventures and schemes. The words had stung, not because they were harsh, but because they carried the weight of painful realization. My mother had finally seen what I'd been trying to tell her for 3 years, that Scott Everett was a man who saw other people's assets as solutions to his problems. Mom, if you're worried about Scott's financial management, maybe we should talk. It's too late for talking, she had interrupted, her voice carrying a firmness I hadn't heard in weeks. Margaret, I love Scott, I do, but love doesn't make someone trustworthy with money. His restaurant venture has already cost us $40,000. The consulting business he started last year lost another $15,000. He sees money as something that should flow toward him, regardless of where it comes from or what it was intended for. She had paused, gathering strength for what came next. I won't let him gamble away 4 generations of careful saving and investment. Your great-grandmother survived the Depression by being prudent with money. Your grandmother built wealth by being disciplined and strategic. I protected and grew that wealth through careful planning. It doesn't belong to Scott, and it never will. I had opened the envelope with shaking hands, scanning the legal documents that laid out the intricate structure of the trust. Every provision was carefully crafted, every contingency anticipated. The trust was irrevocable. Once established, it couldn't be modified or dissolved. The funds could only be accessed by me, and only under specific circumstances. Most importantly, the documentation clearly stated that the trust was separate from any marital assets and explicitly excluded any claims from my mother's spouse or his estate. Leonard spent weeks making sure this was bulletproof, my mother had explained, watching me read. Scott will never even know it exists. The bank statements will go to a post office box that only you and Leonard know about. The trust documents will be held by Leonard's firm in a secure file that requires your signature to access. But Mom, what if something happens and Scott finds out? What if he tries to... Then he'll discover that some things aren't his to take, she had said with quiet steel in her voice, and he'll learn what happens when someone tries to steal from our family. Those words echoed in my mind now as I sat in the Chicago hotel room, understanding for the first time the full scope of my mother's foresight. She had anticipated exactly what had happened today. She had seen Scott's true nature and built defenses against it, even as she continued to love him. The trust documents were still in my safe at home, along with something else Scott didn't know about, a letter my mother had written to me during her final week, meant to be opened only if Scott ever attempted to claim assets that weren't his. I had read that letter once, the day after her funeral, and then sealed it away, hoping I'd never need it again, but I remembered every word. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means Scott has shown his true colors. I'm not surprised, though I'm sorry you had to see it. The trust I established contains $800,000, money that represents everything our family worked for, saved for, and protected for generations. It's your birthright, your security, your freedom to make choices without financial pressure. Scott will tell you he needs it, that it's for a good cause, that I would have wanted him to have it. None of that is true. I established this trust specifically to keep it away from him because I knew this day would come. He sees money as something he's entitled to, regardless of the source or the sacrifice required to accumulate it. Don't let him take what isn't his, Margaret. Don't let him steal from our family's legacy. And don't feel guilty about protecting what's yours. I loved Scott, but I love you more. I trusted Scott with my heart, but I trusted you with everything else. Fight for what's ours, sweetheart. Fight with everything you have. Now, sitting in the hotel room with the city lights blurring through tears I hadn't expected, I understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about honoring my mother's final wishes. It was about protecting the legacy of 4 generations of strong women who had built something meaningful and lasting. Scott had stolen more than $800,000. He had stolen my mother's peace of mind, her final gift to me, her last act of protection and love. And for that, he was going to pay with everything he had. The next morning, I found myself in the hotel's business center at 6 a.m., the soft hum of printers and computers providing a sterile backdrop as I accessed files I hadn't looked at in years. The conference didn't resume until 9 a.m., giving me 3 hours to do something I should have done long ago: compile a comprehensive record of Scott Everett's pattern of financial manipulation. My mother hadn't been his first victim. She had simply been his most successful target. I started with public records, something any competent attorney would have done before marrying into a family. The Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection database yielded the first red flag. Scott had been cited twice for unlicensed contracting work, both times for taking deposits on home renovation projects that were never completed. The complaints dated back 8 years, well before he'd met my mother. Next came the business registrations. Scott had registered 17 different LLCs over the past decade, each one dissolved within 18 months for failure to pay taxes or maintain proper documentation. The names painted a picture of perpetual reinvention: Everett Construction Solutions, New England Hospitality Ventures, Connecticut Investment Consulting, Shoreline Property Development. Each entity had been created with grand promises and dissolved in quiet failure. The restaurant venture he'd mentioned to my mother, the one that had cost her $40,000, was actually his third attempt at the hospitality business. The first 2 had ended in bankruptcy, leaving suppliers and investors empty-handed, while Scott walked away claiming he'd been blindsided by market conditions. But it was the divorce records that revealed the true scope of his pattern. Scott had been married twice before my mother. His first wife, Sienna Michaels, had filed for divorce after discovering that Scott had forged her signature on a home equity loan application, using their house as collateral for a business venture she'd never approved. The divorce decree included a restraining order, preventing Scott from accessing any of her financial accounts, and a judgment for $85,000 in fraudulently obtained funds. His second wife, Honey Gill, had lasted only 14 months. According to the court filings, Scott had convinced her to invest her inheritance from her father, a retired firefighter, into a guaranteed return investment scheme that turned out to be an elaborate shell game involving 3 of his defunct LLCs. When Honey discovered that her $120,000 inheritance had been used to pay Scott's personal debts, she'd filed for divorce and criminal charges. The criminal charges were eventually dropped when Scott agreed to a settlement that cleaned out his remaining assets. The pattern was so clear it might as well have been highlighted in fluorescent ink. Scott identified women with financial resources, charmed his way into their lives, gained access to their money through legal or quasi-legal means, and then transferred those funds to cover his perpetual business failures and personal debts. When confronted, he invariably claimed good intentions, unforeseen circumstances, and temporary setbacks that would surely be resolved if given just a little more time. My mother had been different only in that she was older, wiser, and had protection mechanisms in place that his previous wives had lacked. The trust had been her way of setting a trap, money visible enough to tempt Scott into revealing his true nature, but protected enough that he couldn't actually access it. Except Scott had found a way around her protections, or thought he had. I pulled up Jerry Everett's professional history next, and the picture that emerged was almost as damning as Scott's. Jerry had graduated from a third-tier law school with a 2.3 GPA, passed the bar exam on his third attempt, and had been practicing law for 12 years without ever handling a case involving trusts and estates above $50,000. His disciplinary record was extensive. In addition to the 2 suspensions Chandler had mentioned, Jerry had received 3 formal reprimands from the state bar, once for missing court deadlines due to calendar confusion, once for providing legal advice in areas outside his competence, and once for failing to communicate with clients about the status of their cases. Most relevant to Scott's situation, Jerry had been sanctioned just 6 months ago for advising a client that he could legally access his ex-wife's retirement account because they had been married when she established it. The client had followed Jerry's advice, been arrested for theft, and subsequently sued Jerry for malpractice. The case was still pending, with Jerry's malpractice insurance company already indicating they might not cover the claim due to his history of working outside his area of expertise. This was the attorney Scott had trusted with the most significant financial decision of his life. I leaned back in the business center chair, staring at the computer screen filled with evidence of systematic incompetence and fraud. Scott's entire adult life had been built on a foundation of taking what didn't belong to him, confident that charm and manipulation could overcome any legal obstacles. He'd developed such expertise at financial deception that he'd convinced himself he was untouchable. But there was something else in the records, something that made my blood run cold. In the divorce proceedings with Honey Gill, Scott's attorney, not Jerry, but a different lawyer named Will Phillips, had argued that Scott's actions weren't fraudulent because he had genuinely believed he was entitled to access his wife's inheritance as her husband. The strategy had worked. The criminal charges were dropped, and Scott had emerged from the divorce with nothing more than a civil judgment that he'd largely ignored. Scott had learned that playing dumb was profitable. He'd discovered that claiming ignorance of the law could shield him from criminal consequences, leaving his victims with nothing but civil remedies against a man who rarely had attachable assets. Now he was using the same strategy with my mother's trust. Claim he thought he had the right to access it, hide behind Jerry Everett's incompetent legal advice, and challenge anyone who disagreed to pursue costly, time-consuming civil litigation against a man who had already proven skilled at hiding assets and declaring bankruptcy. It was brilliant in its cynicism. It was also about to be his downfall. Because this time, Scott hadn't stolen from a grieving widow or a trusting young wife. He'd stolen from someone with the resources, knowledge, and motivation to pursue justice at the federal level. He'd stolen from someone married to a federal judge who specialized in white-collar crime and had exactly zero tolerance for financial fraud. Most importantly, he'd stolen from someone who now understood that this wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. This was the culmination of a 20-year career built on systematic theft, enabled by an attorney too incompetent to understand the federal implications of interstate wire fraud. I printed the documents, organized them into neat files, and slipped them into my briefcase. Tonight, when I returned home, I would show Chandler everything. Not as a wife seeking revenge, but as a prosecutor presenting evidence of a federal crime that demanded investigation. Scott thought he'd stolen my inheritance. What he'd actually done was provide me with enough evidence to end his career of victimizing vulnerable women. And unlike his previous wives, I had no intention of settling for a civil judgment he could ignore. The flight from Chicago to Hartford felt different from any journey I'd ever taken. As the Boeing 737 climbed through the cloud cover over Lake Michigan, I stared out the small window at the city shrinking below and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that comes with holding all the cards in a game your opponent doesn't even know he's playing. Chandler was waiting for me at Bradley International Airport, his tall frame unmistakable even in the crowd of arriving passengers. 22 years of marriage had taught me to read his moods from across a room, and I could see the concern in his dark eyes as I approached. He wrapped me in his familiar embrace, and for a moment I allowed myself to sink into the comfort of his strength. "How was the conference?" he asked as we walked toward baggage claim, his hand warm against the small of my back. "Illuminating," I replied, and something in my tone made him glance at me sharply. "Margaret," his voice carried the gentle authority I'd heard him use in countless courtrooms. "What happened?" I waited until we were in his BMW, pulling out of the airport parking garage, before I answered. The December evening was crisp and clear, the lights of Hartford visible in the distance like scattered diamonds against black velvet. "Scott called yesterday," I said simply. Chandler's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. In our years together, he'd learned to recognize the significance of my calm tone when discussing my stepfather. And he's liquidated my mother's trust fund, $800,000, transferred to his personal accounts yesterday morning to cover debts from his failed restaurant venture. The BMW swerved slightly as Chandler's attention snapped to me. "He what?" "Wire fraud," I continued conversationally, as if discussing weekend plans. "Interstate transfer of funds from a Connecticut-based trust to accounts in New York, executed without legal authority based on advice from an attorney who's currently under investigation for ethics violations. Chandler pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and put the car in park, turning to face me fully. His expression had shifted from concern to something much sharper, the look he wore when evaluating evidence in his chambers. "Margaret, tell me everything, from the beginning." I did. I told him about Scott's smugly confident phone call, about Jerry Everett's incompetent legal advice, about the research I'd conducted at the Hotel Business Center. I pulled out the files I'd compiled and handed them to him, watching his expression grow progressively darker as he scanned the documents in the dim light of the parking lot. "My God," he breathed, looking up from Jerry Everett's disciplinary record. "Margaret, do you understand what you're holding here?" "A federal case," I replied quietly. "Multiple federal cases." He flipped through the pages documenting Scott's pattern of fraud. "This isn't just about your trust fund. This is RICO territory, a pattern of racketeering activity spanning multiple states and multiple victims. The interstate nature of the transactions, the use of wire communications, the systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals." He shook his head slowly. "This is exactly the kind of case the Justice Department has been prioritizing." I leaned back against the leather seat, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. For 3 days, I'd carried this knowledge alone, uncertain whether I was overreacting or whether my legal instincts were correct. Hearing Chandler's assessment confirmed what I'd suspected. Scott hadn't just made a mistake. He'd committed multiple federal felonies, with evidence so clear that prosecution would be virtually guaranteed. "There's something else," I said, reaching into my purse for the letter my mother had written. "Mom knew this would happen." Chandler read the letter twice, his jaw clenching as he absorbed my mother's final words. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to me. "She was protecting you," he said softly. "Even from the grave, she was trying to shield you from his predatory behavior. And now he's stolen from her anyway." "No," Chandler's voice carried absolute certainty. "He's attempted to steal from her. There's a significant legal difference." He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway toward Westfield. The familiar landmarks of our neighborhood appeared in the darkness. The country club where we'd been married, the elementary school where I'd volunteered for reading programs, the quiet suburban streets that had been our sanctuary for over 2 decades. "What's our next move?" I asked as we turned into our driveway. Chandler parked in the garage and turned off the engine, sitting quietly for a moment before answering. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to make some calls. The Connecticut U.S. Attorney's Office has an excellent white-collar crime unit. They'll want to see everything you've compiled." "And Scott?" "Scott is about to discover that federal investigations move much faster than civil litigation." Chandler's voice carried a cold satisfaction that I'd rarely heard before. "He thinks he has time to hide assets, manipulate witnesses, or negotiate his way out of this. He doesn't understand that wire fraud involving amounts over $500,000 carries a mandatory minimum sentence." We walked into our house, the federal colonial we'd restored together, filled with books and memories and the quiet comfort of a life built on mutual respect and shared values. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where justice and order prevailed over chaos and greed. As I unpacked in our bedroom, Chandler stood in the doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Are you sure about this, Margaret? Once we start this process, there's no going back. Scott will face serious prison time." I folded my conference materials carefully, thinking about my mother's letter, about Scott's slug confidence on the phone, about the pattern of victims he'd left in his wake. "He made his choice when he decided to steal from my family," I said finally. "Now he gets to live with the consequences." The next morning, I drove to Scott's house in West Hartford with the methodical precision of a surgeon making the first incision. It was 10:30 a.m. on a Thursday, late enough that he'd be awake and comfortable, early enough that he wouldn't be expecting visitors. I wanted to see him in his natural habitat, basking in what he believed was his victory. The house sat on Elmwood Avenue, a modest Cape Cod that my mother had purchased in 2019 during their brief period of marital optimism. She'd paid $340,000 for it, with funds from her professor's pension, money she'd saved over 30 years of academic frugality. Now, as I pulled into the driveway behind Scott's gleaming new Lexus SUV, I realized I was looking at approximately $65,000 worth of my stolen inheritance parked in front of a house my mother had bought with her life's work. The front door opened before I could knock. Scott appeared in the doorway, wearing an expensive-looking cashmere sweater I'd never seen before, and sporting the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from believing you've successfully outmaneuvered your opponents. "Margaret!" His voice carried false warmth and barely concealed satisfaction. "What a pleasant surprise! I wasn't expecting to see you so soon after our conversation." "I was in the neighborhood," I replied smoothly, allowing my gaze to drift meaningfully to the Lexus. "New car?" Scott's chest puffed out slightly with pride. "Just picked it up yesterday. Figured it was time to treat myself to something reliable. You know how it is. Sometimes you have to invest in quality." The irony was breathtaking. He was literally showing off his crime to the victim, apparently confident that I was too powerless or too naive to do anything about it. "It's beautiful," I said sincerely. "Must have been expensive." "Well, you know what they say. You can't put a price on peace of mind." He gestured for me to come inside, his movements loose and comfortable. Come in, come in. I was just having coffee. Can I offer you something?" I followed him into the living room, noting the subtle changes since my last visit 6 months ago. A new 75-inch television dominated one wall, easily $3,000. The old furniture had been replaced with a leather sectional that probably cost another $8,000. Fresh flowers sat in an expensive crystal vase on the coffee table, and the scent of gourmet coffee filled the air. "You've redecorated," I observed, settling into the butter-soft leather sofa. "Felt like it was time for a fresh start," Scott replied, pouring coffee from what appeared to be a high-end espresso machine. "Your mother always preferred the old-fashioned style, but I'm more of a modern guy, you know? Clean lines, contemporary aesthetic." He handed me a cup of coffee in bone china that still had the price tag mentally attached. Bernardeau, probably $200 per place setting based on the pattern. Scott was spending my inheritance with the enthusiasm of a lottery winner, apparently convinced that his theft had been so clever it was essentially legal. "The fresh start seems to be agreeing with you," I said, accepting the coffee with steady hands. "It really is." Scott settled back into his chair with obvious satisfaction. "You know, Margaret, I was worried about how you'd take the news about the trust fund, but your reaction really put my mind at ease. Shows real maturity, real understanding of family obligations." I sipped the coffee, expensive Brazilian beans, another unnecessary luxury purchased with stolen money, and let him continue. "I mean, your mother always raised you to be practical, to understand that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. She'd be proud of how you handled this." The casual invocation of my mother's memory while sitting surrounded by items purchased with money stolen from her estate was staggering in its audacity. Scott wasn't just a thief. He was a thief who'd convinced himself he was the hero of his own story. "Speaking of difficult decisions," I said carefully, "have you had a chance to review the trust documentation yourself? Beyond what Jerry told you, I mean." Scott waved a dismissive hand. "Jerry handled all the legal technicalities. That's what lawyers are for, right? I'm not going to pretend I understand all the fine print and legal jargon. I leave that to the professionals." "Of course. And Jerry assured you that the transfer was completely legitimate?" "Absolutely, 100%. Scott's confidence was unwavering. He explained the whole thing, how my marriage to your mother gave me legal authority over her estate, how trust funds from before our marriage become marital property, all that complex legal stuff. Jerry's been practicing law for years. He knows what he's doing." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this explanation for the first time. It does sound complicated. I'm sure Jerry did his research thoroughly. Oh, he did. Spent weeks going through the statutes, checking precedents. He's very thorough, very professional, not like some of these young lawyers who rush through everything. The image of Jerry Everett, suspended twice for ethics violations, currently under investigation, and utterly incompetent in trust and estate law, being described as thorough and professional was almost enough to make me laugh out loud. Well, that's reassuring, I said, standing to leave. I'd hate to think there were any complications. Scott rose as well, his movements relaxed and confident. No complications at all. Everything's perfectly legal, perfectly above board. Jerry made sure of that. He walked me to the door, and I could practically feel his satisfaction radiating like heat from a fire. Scott believed he had won completely, stolen my inheritance, bought himself a new lifestyle, and convinced me to accept it all with gracious resignation. "Thanks for understanding, Margaret," he said as I stepped onto the porch. "Family has to stick together, especially during difficult transitions." I turned back to face him, allowing myself a small, enigmatic smile. "Of course, Scott. I hope everything works out exactly as you deserve." Something flickered in his eyes, a moment of uncertainty, as if my phrasing had struck him as odd, but the moment passed quickly, replaced by his usual self-satisfied smirk. "It will," he said confidently. "It already has." I walked to my car, feeling lighter than I had in days. Scott had just confirmed everything I needed to know. He was completely confident in his theft, absolutely convinced that Jerry Everett's legal advice was sound, and utterly unprepared for what was coming next. As I drove away, I could see him in my rearview mirror, standing in the doorway of the house my mother had bought, wearing clothes purchased with my stolen inheritance, completely unaware that he had just provided me with everything I needed to destroy him. Tomorrow, Chandler would make his calls to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and Scott's fresh start would become the beginning of his end. Friday morning found me in the sterile conference room of Hartford Trust and Estate, sitting across from Leonard Gill as he methodically arranged documents on the polished mahogany table. Leonard was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of precise mannerisms that come from 40 years of handling other people's most sensitive financial matters. He had been my mother's attorney for the final 6 months of her life, and now he was about to become Scott's worst nightmare. "I have to admit, Margaret, when you called yesterday, I wasn't entirely surprised," Leonard said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he opened the secure file containing my mother's trust documents. "Your mother was very specific about what might happen after her death. She used the phrase, 'when Scott shows his true colors,' at least 3 times during our meetings." I leaned forward slightly, studying the neat stacks of paperwork. She knew he'd try this? She suspected it strongly enough to build multiple safeguards into the trust structure. Leonard pulled out a document I'd never seen before, a thick legal brief bound in blue covers. "This is a comprehensive analysis of Connecticut and federal trust law that your mother commissioned. She wanted to ensure that her wishes would be legally bulletproof regardless of what Scott might attempt." He opened the brief to a section highlighted in yellow. "The trust is irrevocable, meaning it cannot be modified or dissolved by anyone once established. The assets are held by Fidelity Trust Company as institutional trustee, completely separate from any probate proceedings. Most importantly, the trust explicitly excludes any claims from your mother's spouse or his heirs." "But Scott told me his attorney said the marriage gave him legal authority over the trust," I said, playing devil's advocate. Leonard's expression darkened. "Then his attorney is either incompetent or committing malpractice, possibly both." He pulled out another document. "This is a legal opinion we obtained from Morrison, Keller and Associates, one of the most respected trust and estate firms in New England. They specifically addressed whether a surviving spouse could claim any interest in an irrevocable trust established by the deceased spouse before death." I scanned the legal opinion, noting the firm's letterhead and the signature of a senior partner whose reputation I recognized even from my prosecutor days. "The conclusion is unambiguous," Leonard continued. "No legal authority exists for a surviving spouse to access, modify, or claim assets held in an irrevocable trust established by the deceased spouse, particularly when the trust documents explicitly exclude such claims." "So Scott's transfer of the funds?" is theft, plain and simple. Leonard's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades navigating complex legal issues. The fact that he used wire transfers to move the money between states makes it federal wire fraud. The amounts involved, over $500,000, place it in the category of serious federal felonies. He handed me another document, this one bearing the seal of Fidelity Trust Company. This is a complete record of all transactions involving your mother's trust. As you can see, there were unauthorized wire transfers totaling $847,000 on Tuesday morning at 9:23 a.m. I studied the transaction records, noting the precision of the theft. Scott hadn't just stolen in round numbers, he had taken every available penny down to the final $47 in accrued interest. How did he gain access to the accounts? I asked. Leonard's jaw tightened. That's where it gets interesting. The transfers were initiated using forged authorization documents. Someone created fake letters of authorization bearing your signature and notarization, claiming you were directing the trustee to transfer the funds to Scott as a family emergency loan. He showed me photocopies of the forged documents. The signature was a reasonable approximation of mine, but the notary seal belonged to someone I'd never heard of. A notary public from Bridgeport whose license had been suspended 6 months ago for notarizing documents without proper identification. Scott didn't just commit wire fraud, I realized. He committed forgery, used a fraudulent notary, and probably committed mail fraud by sending fake documents to a federal financial institution. The evidence trail is remarkably clear, Leonard agreed. Your stepfather either orchestrated an elaborate fraud scheme himself or relied on accomplices who were spectacularly incompetent. Either way, he's created a federal case that practically prosecutes itself. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the implications. What about recovery of the funds?
Already in progress. Leonard opened another file, revealing correspondence with federal authorities. The moment Fidelity discovered the fraud, they contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The receiving accounts have been frozen pending investigation. Scott's ability to access or transfer the stolen funds has been completely cut off as of yesterday afternoon. The image of Scott showing off his new Lexus and expensive furniture took on a different meaning. He had been spending money from accounts that were about to be seized by federal authorities. How much did he spend before the freeze? Leonard consulted his notes. Approximately $73,000 in the first 48 hours. Vehicle purchase, furniture, electronics, various luxury items. All of which will be subject to asset forfeiture as proceeds of federal crimes. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Scott's shopping spree had been funded by stolen money that no longer existed in accessible form. Every luxury purchase he'd made was evidence of federal crimes, and every item would be seized and sold to make restitution to the trust. There's one more thing, Leonard said, pulling out a final document. Your mother left specific instructions about what to do if Scott attempted to access the trust fraudulently. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my mother's distinctive handwriting. Below my name, she had written, "To be opened only if Scott proves who he really is." Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message in my mother's careful script. Margaret, if you're reading this, Scott has stolen from our family just as I feared he would. Don't let him convince you this was a misunderstanding or a desperate mistake. This is who he is and who he has always been. Use every legal tool available to ensure he faces the full consequences of his choices. Our family's legacy deserves protection, and you deserve justice. I love you, and I trust you to do what's right. Mom. I folded the letter carefully, feeling the weight of my mother's final wishes. She had anticipated not just Scott's theft, but my potential hesitation to pursue justice against him. Her message was clear. Show no mercy to someone who showed no respect for her dying wishes. Leonard, I said, my voice steady and resolved. I want you to coordinate with federal authorities to ensure they have every piece of evidence available. I want Scott prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. I've already begun that process, he replied. The U.S. Attorney's Office will want to interview you early next week.
They're treating this as a priority case given the clear evidence and the interstate nature of the crimes. As I left Leonard's office with copies of all the documentation, I realized that Scott's confident phone call had set in motion a chain of events he couldn't possibly have anticipated. His theft hadn't just failed, it had created an airtight federal case that would destroy him completely. By Monday, he would discover that stealing from my family carried consequences he'd never imagined. Saturday afternoon, I found myself parked across the street from Scott's house, watching through tinted windows as he hosted what appeared to be an impromptu celebration. Cars filled his driveway and lined the street. Friends and neighbors drawn by the promise of good food and expensive wine, all funded by money that was no longer legally his. Through the large front windows, I could see Scott moving among his guests with the confident swagger of a man who believed he had successfully pulled off the financial coup of his lifetime. He was wearing another new outfit, a designer polo shirt and tailored slacks that probably cost more than most people spend on clothes in 6 months. His gestures were expansive, animated, the body language of someone telling an entertaining story to a captive audience. I lowered my window slightly, letting the December air carry fragments of conversation from the open front door. Scott's voice was louder than the others, holding court, as he described his successful resolution of some complicated estate matters. The way he told it, he'd heroically untangled a complex legal situation that had been weighing on the family for months. A woman I recognized as his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down, emerged onto the front porch holding a glass of what looked like expensive champagne. She was laughing at something Scott had said, clearly charmed by his version of recent events. Behind her, more guests spilled out onto the porch, drinks in hand, all of them basking in the warm glow of Scott's hospitality. My phone buzzed with a text from Chandler. U.S. Attorney confirms meeting Monday 9 a.m. Asset seizure warrants being prepared. How are you holding up? I typed back. Watching Scott celebrate with champagne bought with stolen money. Holding up fine. Where are you? Observing the defendant in his natural habitat.
Margaret, come home. Let the professionals handle surveillance. I smiled at Chandler's protective instincts, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. There was something almost anthropologically fascinating about watching Scott perform his role as the successful host, completely unaware that federal agents were already building a case that would strip away everything he was showing off. The front door opened again, and Scott himself appeared on the porch, his arm around a man I didn't recognize, probably a friend from his construction days. Scott was gesturing toward his new Lexus with obvious pride, apparently regaling his guest with details about the luxury features and superior engineering. The 2 men walked toward the vehicle, Scott pulling out his key fob and chirping the alarm system off with the casual confidence of ownership. What Scott didn't know was that the Lexus would be seized by federal marshals within the week, along with every other item he'd purchased with the stolen funds. The vehicle he was showing off so proudly would be auctioned to help make restitution to my mother's trust, assuming there was anything left after legal fees and penalties. I watched him pop the hood and point out features of the engine to his friend, both men clearly impressed by the quality of German engineering. Scott's enthusiasm was genuine. He truly believed he had earned this lifestyle through his own cleverness and legal maneuvering. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. He had convinced himself so completely that his theft was justified that he felt no guilt about celebrating it publicly. The delivery truck pulled up to the house, and I recognized the logo of Hartford's most expensive catering company. 2 uniformed workers began unloading trays of what appeared to be high-end hors d'oeuvres and premium seafood. Scott directed them toward the backyard, where I could now see he had rented elegant tables, chairs, and what looked like a professional bar setup. The scale of the celebration was staggering. Scott had spent thousands of dollars on a single afternoon's entertainment, money that had been in my mother's trust account just 4 days ago. He was literally throwing a party with the proceeds of his federal crimes, apparently confident that his theft had been so legally sophisticated that celebration was not only appropriate but deserved.
Mrs. Patterson reappeared with a plate of shrimp cocktail, and I could hear her complimenting Scott on his good fortune in finally resolving his financial difficulties. He accepted her praise with false modesty, claiming that sometimes things just work out when you handle them properly. The irony was breathtaking. Scott was being praised for his financial acumen while spending money he'd stolen through forged documents and fraudulent wire transfers. As the afternoon progressed, more guests arrived. I recognized several faces from my mother's funeral, people who had offered condolences and spoken warmly about her contributions to the community. Now they were unknowingly participating in a celebration funded by theft from her estate, charmed by the very man who had violated her final wishes. Around 4 p.m., Scott emerged from the house carrying a microphone connected to a portable sound system. The party was apparently reaching its crescendo, with Scott preparing to address his guests formally. I rolled down my window further, straining to hear his words. "Friends, neighbors, thank you all for sharing this special day with me," Scott's amplified voice carried clearly across the street. "As many of you know, I've been dealing with some challenging financial situations lately. It's been a difficult few months, worrying about the future, wondering how I'd manage to maintain the lifestyle Barbara and I built together." The invocation of my mother's name in the context of his theft celebration made my hands clench involuntarily. "But sometimes," Scott continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident, "life provides solutions when you need them most. Sometimes the people who love you find ways to help, even from beyond the grave. Barbara always wanted me to be financially secure, and thanks to her foresight and generosity, I now am." The applause that followed was enthusiastic, with several guests raising their champagne glasses in toast to Scott's good fortune. He basked in their approval, clearly believing his own narrative about my mother's posthumous generosity. What Scott's guests didn't know was that they were toasting a federal criminal whose good fortune would evaporate the moment FBI agents knocked on his door. I started my car and pulled away from the curb, leaving Scott to his celebration. By Monday morning, he would discover that federal investigations move much faster than his ability to spend stolen money. And his party would become evidence in his prosecution. Monday morning arrived with the sharp clarity that comes before momentous events. I sat in Chandler's study at 6 a.m., surrounded by meticulously organized files, legal briefs, and evidence folders that would soon become the foundation of a federal prosecution. The room smelled of leather and coffee, the familiar scent of justice being methodically prepared. Chandler emerged from his shower, adjusting his tie with the precision of someone who had appeared in federal court thousands of times. But this morning carried a different weight. Today, his wife wasn't just a victim seeking justice, but a key witness in what would likely become one of the clearest cases of wire fraud his colleagues in the U.S. Attorney's Office had seen all year. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, settling into the chair across from his desk where I'd been reviewing my testimony notes. "I've been ready since Scott made that phone call," I replied, tapping the folder containing my mother's letter. "The question is whether Scott is ready for what's coming." My phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn Michaels. "Flying in from New York this morning. Wouldn't miss this for the world. Federal prosecutors stick together." Evelyn's presence would be invaluable, not just for moral support, but for her expertise in white-collar prosecutions. She had handled dozens of similar cases and could help ensure that every legal avenue was properly explored. At 7:30 a.m., Leonard Gill arrived at our house carrying 2 briefcases and the kind of grim determination that comes from watching someone violate a client's dying wishes. He set up his materials on our dining room table with military precision: trust documents, banking records, forensic analyses of the forged signatures, and communications with Fidelity Trust Company's fraud investigation unit. "The overnight developments are significant," Leonard announced without preamble. Scott attempted to access the frozen accounts 3 times yesterday evening. Each attempt generated automatic alerts to federal authorities and created additional evidence of his knowledge that the transactions were fraudulent. Chandler looked up from his coffee with sharp interest. He tried to access accounts he knew were under investigation? Repeatedly. The bank's security system logs show attempts at 6:15 p.m., 8:42 p.m., and 11:33 p.m. Each time, he used the same forged authorization documents that initiated the original theft. He's essentially creating new federal crimes every time he tries to access the accounts. I shook my head in amazement. Scott's digging his hole deeper by the hour. There's more, Leonard continued, opening his second briefcase. Jerry Everett called Fidelity Trust Company this morning, claiming to represent Scott and demanding information about why the accounts were frozen. During that conversation, he made several statements that could constitute obstruction of justice. He handed us a transcript of the recorded call. Jerry's voice came through as frantic and aggressive, demanding that the bank stop interfering with legitimate financial transactions and threatening legal action against Fidelity for unlawfully freezing accounts belonging to his client. Jerry doesn't understand that talking to federal agents investigating his client without proper representation is essentially helping prosecutors build their case, Chandler observed. Every word he said will be used against both of them. At 8:15 a.m., we left for downtown Hartford in Chandler's BMW, the evidence carefully secured in locked briefcases. The federal building loomed ahead of us, its granite facade representing the full weight of federal law enforcement that would soon focus on Scott's crimes. The U.S. Attorney's Office occupied the building's upper floors, and as we entered the conference room where the meeting would take place, I was struck by the professional intensity of the assembled team. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sonia Everett, no relation to either Scott or Jerry, was a woman in her early 40s with the sharp-eyed focus of someone who had built her career prosecuting complex financial crimes. "Mrs. Phillips," she said, standing to shake my hand, "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence, and I have to say, this is one of the most straightforward wire fraud cases I've encountered. Your stepfather has essentially documented his own federal crimes." Joining her was FBI Special Agent Will Michaels, whose specialty was financial fraud investigations. He had already begun coordinating with banking authorities to trace every dollar Scott had stolen and spent. "The beauty of financial crimes," Agent Michaels explained as we settled around the conference table, "is that they create permanent records. Every wire transfer, every forged document, every fraudulent authorization leaves a digital trail that's impossible to erase." He opened a laptop and pulled up a presentation showing Scott's crimes in chronological order. The evidence was overwhelming: forged signatures, fraudulent notarizations, interstate wire transfers, attempts to access frozen accounts, and Jerry Everett's obstructionist phone calls to federal investigators. "We're dealing with multiple felonies here," Ada Everett continued. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery, identity theft, and potentially RICO violations if we can establish this as part of a pattern of fraudulent activity targeting vulnerable individuals." She pulled out Scott's criminal history that I had compiled at the Chicago hotel. "Your research into his previous marriages and business ventures provides the foundation for demonstrating a pattern of fraudulent conduct. This isn't an isolated incident, it's the culmination of a 20-year career built on systematic theft." Evelyn Michaels arrived just as the formal presentation was concluding, her federal prosecutor credentials earning immediate respect from the assembled team. She reviewed the evidence with the practiced eye of someone who had sent dozens of white-collar criminals to federal prison. "This case has everything prosecutors dream of," she announced. "Clear evidence, unsympathetic defendant, sympathetic victim, and crimes so obvious that defense attorneys will be advising immediate guilty pleas." Agent Michaels leaned forward. "Mrs. Phillips, we're going to need you to continue acting normally for the next few days while we finalize the arrest warrants and asset seizure orders. Don't contact Scott directly, but if he contacts you, we need detailed records of everything he says." "What's the timeline?" Chandler asked. "Arrest warrants will be executed Wednesday morning," Ada Everett replied. "Asset seizure will happen simultaneously. By Thursday, Scott will be in federal custody, facing charges that carry 20 to 30 years in prison." As we left the federal building, I felt a profound sense of completion. The wheels of federal justice were now in motion, operated by professionals who understood exactly how to dismantle Scott's criminal enterprise. Scott had 2 more days of freedom to enjoy his stolen luxury. Then his new life would become a federal case number. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp precision of federal justice. At exactly 6:47 a.m., I watched from my kitchen window as 3 black SUVs pulled into Scott's driveway with the coordinated efficiency of a military operation. FBI Special Agent Will Michaels emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by 6 other agents wearing tactical vests marked FBI in bold yellow letters. The arrest warrant was executed with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. Through the telephoto lens of the camera Chandler had suggested I use to document the proceedings, I watched Scott answer his front door in an expensive silk bathrobe, another luxury purchased with my stolen inheritance. His face went through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, indignation, and finally the dawning horror of someone realizing that their carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. Agent Michaels read him his rights, while 2 other agents began the systematic seizure of assets purchased with fraudulent funds. The new Lexus was loaded onto a federal impound truck within 20 minutes. The expensive furniture, electronics, and luxury items Scott had displayed so proudly just 4 days earlier were cataloged, photographed, and removed as evidence of federal crimes. Neighbors emerged from their houses to watch the spectacle, the same people who had celebrated Scott's good fortune now witnessing his complete destruction. By 8:30 a.m., Scott was in federal custody, and his house stood empty except for the basic furnishings that predated his crime spree. The transformation was stunning, from celebration to devastation in less than 2 hours. My phone rang as the last FBI vehicle departed. It was Leonard Gill, calling from the Hartford Trust and Estate Office where he was coordinating with federal authorities. "It's done," he said. "Scott's in custody, Jerry Everett have been arrested as a co-conspirator, and all the stolen funds have been recovered and returned to your mother's trust. All of it, every penny, plus penalties and interest. The federal forfeiture of Scott's purchases will actually result in a net gain to the trust. Your mother's legacy is not only restored, but enhanced." I closed my eyes, feeling a profound sense of justice that seemed to echo from beyond the grave. My mother's careful planning had not only protected her legacy, but ensured that Scott's theft would ultimately strengthen what she had tried to steal. The arraignment was scheduled for that afternoon in federal district court. Chandler couldn't preside due to his personal connection to the case, but he arranged for me to observe from the gallery as Scott faced the full weight of federal justice. Walking into the federal courthouse felt like entering a cathedral of law. The marble corridors echoed with the measured footsteps of attorneys, court officers, and citizens seeking justice. I took my seat in the gallery just as Scott was led into the courtroom in federal detention clothing, his expensive wardrobe replaced by the standard orange jumpsuit of the accused. The contrast was stark and intentional. 4 days ago, Scott had stood in his front yard showing off a luxury vehicle purchased with stolen money. Now he stood before a federal judge, shackled and facing charges that would likely end his freedom for decades. Federal Judge Honey Gill, another ironic coincidence that seemed ordained by fate, reviewed the charges with the clinical precision that federal court demanded. Her voice carried across the courtroom like a bell tolling Scott's doom. The defendant is charged with wire fraud in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1343, a federal felony carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years imprisonment. He is further charged with mail fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Scott's court-appointed attorney, Jerry Everett's arrest had left him without representation, stood silent as Judge Gill continued. The government alleges that Mr. Everett systematically defrauded the victim of over $800,000 through forged documents, fraudulent wire transfers, and conspiracy with a suspended attorney. The evidence presented suggests premeditation, sophistication, and complete disregard for federal law. I watched Scott's face as the reality of his situation became undeniable. The confident smirk he'd worn during our phone conversation was gone, replaced by the hollow expression of someone understanding that their life as they knew it was over. Furthermore, Judge Gill continued, the defendant's attempts to access frozen accounts after being informed of the federal investigation constitute additional acts of fraud and potential obstruction of justice. Scott's attorney made a half-hearted attempt at requesting bail, but the motion was denied immediately. Federal wire fraud involving amounts over $500,000, combined with Scott's history of financial crimes across multiple states, made him an obvious flight risk. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial, Judge Gill announced. Given the strength of the evidence and the defendant's pattern of fraudulent conduct, this court sees no reasonable basis for release. As Scott was led away in shackles, he turned toward the gallery and our eyes met for the first time since his arrest. I saw recognition flicker across his face, the moment he understood that his powerless stepdaughter had orchestrated his complete destruction. I smiled calmly and mouthed the words he had spoken to me just 6 days earlier. Hope it works out. The color drained from his face as he realized that his own words were being used to seal his fate. The federal marshals led him away to begin what would likely be a 20-year sentence, leaving me sitting in the gallery with the profound satisfaction of justice perfectly served. My mother's trust was restored, Scott's victims were vindicated, and federal law had proven that some thefts carry consequences beyond anything the perpetrator can imagine. The federal system had issued its verdict, and Scott Everett would spend the next 2 decades understanding exactly what happens when someone steals from a federal judge's wife. The news of Scott's federal arrest spread through West Hartford with the velocity of wildfire in dry brush. By Thursday morning, the Hartford Courant had run a front-page story with the headline, "Local Man Arrested in $800,000 Federal Wire Fraud Scheme," complete with a photograph of Scott being led away in handcuffs and a detailed account of his systematic theft from his deceased wife's estate. I was having coffee in my kitchen when my phone began ringing incessantly. The first call came from Mrs. Patterson, Scott's neighbor, who had been so charmed by his celebration just days earlier. "Margaret, dear, I am so sorry." Her voice trembled with embarrassment and genuine distress. "I had no idea. We all thought Scott had legitimately inherited money from your mother. The way he talked about it, he made it sound like she had specifically wanted him to be financially secure." "It's not your fault, Mrs. Patterson," I replied gently. "Scott is very skilled at making his lies sound believable. But the party, oh my God, the party! We were celebrating with champagne bought with stolen money. I feel sick about this. How could we have been so naive?" The second call came from Tom Bradley, a contractor Scott had hired to renovate his bathroom using funds stolen from the trust. Tom's voice was a mixture of anger and panic. "Mrs. Phillips, I need to know what's going to happen to the money Scott paid me. My crew worked for 3 weeks on his bathroom renovation, and now I'm hearing on the news that the money was stolen. Are we going to be forced to pay it back?" "I'm not sure about the specifics," I told him truthfully, "but I'd recommend contacting the U.S. Attorney's Office. They'll have information about how restitution works in federal fraud cases." The third call was the most significant. Jerry Everett's wife, Sienna, was calling from the Corrections Visitor Center where she'd just finished meeting with her husband. "Mrs. Phillips, I know you probably don't want to hear from anyone connected to this mess, but I needed to call you." Her voice was thick with tears and exhaustion. "Jerry is completely falling apart. He keeps saying he had no idea that what Scott asked him to do was illegal." I said nothing, letting her continue. "He's been practicing law for 12 years, and he swears he thought Scott had legitimate authority to access your mother's trust. But the federal prosecutors are saying he should have known better, that any competent attorney would have researched the law before advising a client to transfer that much money." "What is Jerry saying about his defense?" "That's just it. He doesn't have one. His own attorney told him this morning that the evidence is overwhelming. The forged documents, the suspended notary, the interstate wire transfers. Jerry's lawyer says the best he can hope for is a plea agreement that might get him 5 years instead of 15. Sienna's voice broke completely. "We have 3 children, Mrs. Phillips. Jerry's going to lose his law license, we're going to lose our house, and the kids are going to grow up with their father in federal prison. All because he was too lazy or too stupid to research trust law before he helped Scott steal from you." The human cost of Scott's crimes was becoming clear. Jerry Everett wasn't just facing federal charges, his entire family was being destroyed by his professional incompetence and willingness to help Scott commit fraud. I'm sorry for what your family is going through, I said carefully, but Jerry made the choice to provide legal advice in an area where he wasn't competent. That's not something that happened to him, it's something he chose to do. I know, Sienna whispered. I know it's his fault. I wanted you to know that there are children who are going to suffer because of what my husband did to help Scott steal from your family. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling the complex weight of justice served. Scott's crimes had created ripple effects that extended far beyond his own life. His victims included not just my family, but everyone who had been drawn into his web of fraud and deception. By afternoon, the phone calls had shifted from apologies to something more disturbing. Scott's sister, Margaret Gill, called from Phoenix, her voice sharp with accusation. I don't know what kind of vendetta you're pursuing, but destroying Scott's life over a family financial dispute is cruel and vindictive. Scott committed federal wire fraud, I replied calmly. I didn't destroy his life. He did that himself when he decided to steal from my mother's estate. Family money should stay in the family. Your mother loved Scott, and she would have wanted him to have financial security. You're being selfish and vengeful. The attempt to rewrite history and portray Scott as the victim was breathtaking in its audacity. Scott forged documents and stole $800,000 using fraudulent wire transfers. That's not a family dispute. It's a federal crime. You could have handled this privately, worked something out between family members. Instead, you've chosen to ruin his life and destroy Jerry Everett's family. I hope you're proud of yourself. I am, I replied evenly. Scott chose to commit federal crimes rather than live within his means. Now he gets to face federal consequences. That's not revenge, it's justice. Margaret hung up without another word, but her call had revealed something important. Scott's family was rallying around the narrative that he was the victim of my vindictiveness, rather than the perpetrator of systematic fraud. That evening, as I reviewed the day's events with Chandler, I realized that Scott's arrest was just the beginning. The real consequences, the trials, the sentences, the long-term destruction of the lives he'd touched would unfold over months and years. Any regrets? Chandler asked as we sat in his study reviewing legal documents. I thought about Mrs. Patterson's embarrassment, Tom Bradley's panic, Sienna Everett's tears, and Margaret Gill's accusations. Scott's crimes had created a circle of destruction that would affect dozens of people for years to come.
None, I said finally. Scott made his choices. Now everyone else gets to live with the consequences of trusting a federal criminal. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new consequences, and new victims emerging from the wreckage of Scott's fraudulent empire. But tonight, my mother's legacy was secure, and justice was being methodically served. The systematic destruction of Scott's life unfolded with the methodical precision of a federal investigation. Within 2 weeks of his arrest, every aspect of his carefully constructed existence began crumbling like a house built on quicksand. The first domino fell when Connecticut banking authorities froze all of Scott's remaining accounts pending a comprehensive audit. The investigation revealed a pattern of financial irregularities dating back 5 years: suspicious cash deposits, unexplained transfers between accounts, and loan applications containing false information about his income and assets. First National Bank of Hartford filed a civil lawsuit seeking immediate repayment of a $75,000 home equity loan Scott had obtained 6 months earlier. The loan application claimed he earned $180,000 annually from construction consulting, but bank investigators discovered that Scott's actual income was less than $30,000, derived primarily from sporadic handyman work and unemployment benefits. The loan had been secured using my mother's house as collateral, with Scott forging her signature on documents filed just 3 weeks before her death. Bank officials realized they had been defrauded and moved aggressively to recover their funds through foreclosure proceedings. The second domino was Scott's relationship with the IRS. Federal investigators discovered that Scott had never reported the $847,000 trust fund transfer as income, despite spending over $70,000 of it within 48 hours. The failure to report such a significant financial transaction triggered an automatic audit that revealed years of tax evasion and unreported income. IRS Criminal Investigation Division Special Agent Leonard Phillips contacted me directly to discuss Scott's tax crimes.
Mrs. Phillips, your stepfather owes approximately $340,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest dating to 2019, he explained during our phone conversation. The trust fund theft represents additional taxable income of $847,000, which creates a federal tax liability of roughly $280,000. So Scott owes the IRS over $600,000? At minimum, we're also investigating whether his previous business ventures involved unreported income or fraudulent tax claims. The total liability could exceed $800,000 before we're finished. The IRS moved with characteristic efficiency, filing liens against every asset Scott owned or claimed to own. The house my mother had purchased, the tools and equipment from his construction business, even his personal possessions were now subject to federal seizure to satisfy his tax debts. The third domino involved Scott's professional reputation within the local construction community. Word of his federal arrest spread quickly among contractors, suppliers, and former clients, many of whom began examining their own dealings with Scott under a new and suspicious light. Mason Supply Company filed a lawsuit claiming Scott had never paid for $15,000 worth of materials delivered to various job sites over the past 2 years. Their investigation revealed that Scott had been billing clients for materials he received on credit, collecting payment from homeowners, but never paying the suppliers. 3 former clients filed complaints with the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection, claiming Scott had taken deposits for home improvement projects that were never completed. Each client had paid Scott between $8,000 and $12,000 for work that was either never started or abandoned halfway through completion. The pattern was becoming clear. Scott had been operating a systematic fraud scheme for years, taking money from multiple sources while delivering nothing of value in return. His arrest for federal wire fraud had simply exposed the tip of a much larger criminal iceberg. The fourth domino was perhaps the most personally satisfying. Jerry Everett's law license was suspended pending a disciplinary hearing by the Connecticut Bar Association. The suspension meant that every legal document Jerry had prepared for Scott over the past 2 years was now subject to review and potential invalidation. This included the power of attorney documents Scott had used to access my mother's bank accounts during her final illness, the estate planning documents Jerry had prepared after my mother's death, and, most importantly, the legal opinions Jerry had provided regarding Scott's authority to access the trust fund.
Connecticut Bar Association investigator Evelyn Gill contacted me to discuss Jerry's professional conduct. Mrs. Phillips, we're investigating whether Mr. Everett engaged in a pattern of providing legal advice outside his area of competence. Your case appears to be part of a larger pattern of malpractice. How many other cases are you reviewing? 17 families have filed complaints alleging that Mr. Everett provided incompetent legal advice regarding estate planning, trust administration, and probate matters. In each case, his advice resulted in significant financial losses for his clients. Jerry wasn't just facing federal criminal charges, he was also facing professional destruction and multiple malpractice lawsuits that would financially ruin him for the rest of his life. The fifth and final domino was Scott's social standing in the community. The Hartford Courant had been following the case closely, publishing weekly updates about new charges, additional victims, and the growing scope of the federal investigation. The newspaper's investigation revealed that Scott had borrowed money from at least 6 different neighbors and friends over the past 3 years, always with promises of quick repayment once his business deals closed. None of the loans had been repaid, and several lenders were now considering legal action. Mrs. Patterson called me again, this time with a very different tone. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Did Scott ever borrow money from your mother during their marriage?" "Yes," I replied. "She mentioned several times that Scott needed help with business expenses." "How much?" I consulted the financial records Leonard Gill had compiled. Over $60,000 in the 2 years before she died. She always described it as helping with temporary cash flow problems. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. "He borrowed $8,000 from my husband and me last Christmas, said he needed it to cover payroll for his construction crew until a big job paid out in January. We never saw a penny of it back." The call ended with Mrs. Patterson asking for the contact information for the FBI's Victim Services Coordinator. Scott's web of deception had ensnared even his closest neighbors, people who had trusted him based on his marriage to my mother.
By the end of February, Scott's life had been completely dismantled. He faced federal criminal charges carrying up to 30 years in prison, civil lawsuits seeking over $200,000 in damages, IRS liens exceeding $800,000, professional ostracism, and social disgrace. Every aspect of his existence had been built on lies, fraud, and the exploitation of people who trusted him. Now, the federal justice system was methodically stripping away every fraudulent layer, revealing the hollow core of a man who had never built anything legitimate in his entire adult life. 3 months after his arrest, Scott Everett was released on supervised federal bail pending his trial, a decision that surprised everyone involved in the case. His court-appointed attorney had argued successfully that Scott posed no flight risk due to his complete lack of financial resources and the federal monitoring systems that would track his every movement. He was required to wear an ankle monitor, surrender his passport, and report to a federal probation officer twice weekly. Most significantly, he was prohibited from accessing any financial accounts or making any transactions over $500 without prior approval from federal authorities. Scott had been living in a halfway house in Hartford since his release, all of his assets either seized by federal authorities or claimed by creditors. The man who had once shown off luxury purchases bought with stolen money was now dependent on government assistance for basic necessities. On a gray Thursday afternoon in March, I was in my garden planting early spring bulbs when I heard the distinctive sound of footsteps on gravel. I looked up to see Scott walking slowly up our driveway, his appearance so dramatically altered that I barely recognized him. The expensive clothing was gone, replaced by ill-fitting jeans and a worn winter coat that had clearly been donated. He had lost at least 30 pounds, his face gaunt and hollow, with the haunted expression of someone who had watched their entire world collapse. The ankle monitor was visible above his scuffed sneakers, a constant reminder of his federal supervision. "Margaret," he said quietly, stopping about 10 feet away from where I knelt among the flower beds. "I know I probably shouldn't be here, but I need to talk to you." I continued planting bulbs, not looking up. "You're violating the restraining order the court issued to protect me from contact with defendants in federal cases. Please," his voice cracked with desperation, "just 5 minutes. I'm not here to threaten you or cause trouble. I'm here to beg." The word hung in the cold air between us. Scott Everett, who had spent 3 years manipulating my mother and had called me smugly to announce his theft of her legacy, was now begging for my attention. 5 minutes, I said finally, still focused on the soil and bulbs. "But I'm calling the probation office the moment you leave to report this contact." Scott moved closer, his movements cautious and defeated. "Margaret, I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt you and dishonored your mother's memory. I'm not here to make excuses or ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve either one." I glanced up at him then, noting the genuine anguish in his eyes. Prison and the systematic destruction of his life had stripped away the arrogant facade, revealing something raw underneath. "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm going to prison for 20 years, he said simply. "Maybe longer. The federal prosecutor is pushing for 30 years because of my criminal history and the amount of money involved. My attorney says the best plea deal I can hope for is 15 years with full restitution." He paused, watching me work with dirt-stained hands among the flowers my mother had loved. "I'm 62 years old, Margaret. Even if I get the minimum sentence, I'll be 77 when I'm released. My health is already failing from the stress and the conditions in the detention center. There's a good chance I'll die in federal prison." "That was your choice when you decided to steal from my family," I replied evenly, pressing tulip bulbs into the rich soil. "You're right, it was." Scott's voice grew quieter, more fragile. "But I'm not here about me. I'm here about something else." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, setting it carefully on the garden path between us. "These are letters from your mother. Letters she wrote to me during the last months of her life, when she was in the hospital and knew she was dying." I stopped planting, my attention fully focused on the envelope. "She wrote about you, Margaret. About how proud she was of you, how much she loved you, how grateful she was that you had found happiness with Chandler. She wrote about her fears for the future, her regrets about marrying me, her wishes for how she wanted to be remembered. Scott's voice broke completely. She knew, Margaret. She knew I was going to try to take what wasn't mine. She wrote about it specifically, about how she hoped you would be strong enough to stop me when the time came. I reached for the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of my mother's final thoughts. Why are you giving me this? Because in one of the letters, she wrote something that I think you need to hear. Scott wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. She said that if I ever came to you begging for mercy after stealing from her trust, you should remember that forgiveness doesn't require enabling someone's continued destructive behavior. He stood slowly, his movements stiff and painful. Your mother was the only person who ever truly loved me, and I repaid that love by stealing from her estate and dishonoring her memory. I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. Scott turned to leave, then paused. I just wanted you to have her words, and I wanted you to know that she was right about everything. About me, about what I would do, and about how strong you would need to be to stop me. He walked away slowly, leaving me kneeling in the garden with my mother's final letters in my hands. Hope it works out, Scott, I called after him, using the same words he had spoken to me months earlier when he thought he had won. He stopped walking, but didn't turn around. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he realized that even in his moment of complete defeat, I was reminding him of his own arrogance. Scott Everett continued down the driveway toward whatever remained of his life, while I sat among the spring flowers reading my mother's final gift. Words of love, wisdom, and the unshakable belief that justice would ultimately prevail. I read my mother's letters that evening in Chandler's study, each page revealing the depth of her understanding about Scott's true nature and her unwavering faith in my ability to protect our family's legacy. Her words were prophetic, written by a dying woman who had seen clearly what others chose to ignore. Margaret, Scott will try to convince you that desperation drove him to theft, that his circumstances left him no choice. Don't believe him. I've watched him for 3 years, and he has never once chosen the difficult path of honest work over the easy path of taking what belongs to others. He is a man who believes the world owes him comfort, regardless of what he's willing to earn. When he comes to you, and he will come to you, remember that mercy is not the same as enabling. True mercy sometimes requires allowing people to face the full consequences of their choices, so they might finally understand the difference between right and wrong. The final letter was dated just 2 days before her death. If you're reading this, it means Scott has shown you exactly who he is. I'm not surprised, though I'm sorry you had to see it. Don't let anyone convince you that prosecuting him fully is cruel or vindictive. Protecting what our family built over generations is an act of love, not revenge. Stand strong, my darling girl. Justice served with dignity is a gift to future victims who won't have to suffer because you chose to act. 2 weeks after Scott's desperate visit to my garden, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sonia Everett called with news about his plea negotiations. Scott's attorney contacted us this morning requesting a meeting, she informed me. They want to discuss a cooperation agreement where Scott would provide information about other individuals he's defrauded in exchange for a reduced sentence. What kind of reduction? They're asking for 10 years instead of 25. Scott claims he can provide evidence against at least 12 other people involved in similar fraud schemes across New England. I considered this development carefully. Scott's cooperation could help other victims receive justice, but it would also allow him to escape the full consequences of his systematic criminal behavior. What's your recommendation? Honestly, we don't need Scott's cooperation to build strong cases against other defendants. His information might save us some investigative time, but it's not essential. The decision about whether to offer him a deal is really about whether you believe he deserves consideration for cooperation. That afternoon, I called ADA Everett back with my decision. No deal, I said simply. Scott has spent his entire adult life escaping consequences through manipulation and false promises of cooperation. This time, he faces the full penalty for his choices. Are you certain? 10 years is still a significant prison sentence for a 62-year-old man. I'm certain. My mother trusted me to ensure that Scott learned the difference between right and wrong. A reduced sentence won't teach him anything, except that crime pays if you're willing to betray your accomplices. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Scott would appear before federal judge Honey Gill to formally acknowledge his guilt and accept a 25-year sentence without the possibility of parole. On the morning of the hearing, I sat in the gallery watching Scott shuffle into the courtroom in shackles, his federal detention uniform replacing the expensive clothes he'd bought with my stolen inheritance. When Judge Gill asked if he had any final statements before sentencing, Scott turned toward the gallery until his eyes found mine. "I hope it works out," he said quietly, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. But this time, the words carried no smugness, no arrogance, no false confidence. They were the admission of a broken man who finally understood that he had destroyed his own life through choices that could never be undone. Scott Everett would spend the next quarter-century in federal prison, and I would spend that time knowing that justice had been served with the dignity my mother had requested. Her legacy was secure, her trust had been restored, and her final wishes had been honored completely. Some thefts carry consequences that last a lifetime. Scott had finally learned that lesson. 6 months after Scott's sentencing, I stood in my mother's house for the first time since her funeral, keys heavy in my hand as I unlocked the door that would never again open for the man who had tried to steal everything she had built. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if Scott's presence had been a shadow that federal marshals had finally removed along with his fraudulent purchases. The expensive furniture and electronics were gone, seized and sold to pay restitution, leaving behind only the pieces my mother had chosen herself during her lifetime. I walked through each room slowly, my fingers trailing over surfaces she had touched, rediscovering the home she had created before Scott's influence changed everything. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her lavender tea. The living room still held the comfortable reading chair where she'd spent countless evenings grading papers and planning lessons. In her bedroom, I found something Scott had overlooked during his occupation, a small cedar box hidden behind books on her nightstand. Inside were photographs of our family spanning 4 generations, documents related to property my grandmother had owned, and a sealed envelope marked "For Margaret's New Beginning." The letter inside was brief but transformative.
My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means you've successfully protected our family's legacy from Scott's greed. I'm proud of you for having the strength to pursue justice, even when others tried to convince you that mercy meant enabling his continued criminal behavior. This house is yours now, free and clear. The trust fund has been restored, and you have the financial freedom to make choices based on what brings you joy rather than what pays the bills. Use both the house and the money to build something beautiful, something worthy of the generations of strong women who sacrificed to make your security possible. Most importantly, don't let Scott's betrayal make you cynical about human nature. Most people are good, honest, and deserving of trust. Scott was an exception, not the rule. Continue to lead with kindness, but remember that kindness includes protecting yourself and others from those who would exploit it. Build something beautiful, my darling girl. You've earned the right to create without fear. Over the following weeks, I began the process of reclaiming and restoring what Scott had tried to corrupt. I hired a team to remove every trace of his modifications to the house, the garish improvements he'd made with borrowed money, the expensive fixtures installed to impress visitors, the ostentatious decorations that reflected his values rather than my mother's. In their place, I restored the quiet elegance my mother had preferred, soft colors that complemented the natural light, comfortable furniture chosen for durability rather than status, books and artwork that reflected genuine interests rather than calculated image management. The process was deeply therapeutic. Each room I restored felt like a conversation with my mother, a way of honoring her memory by preserving her vision of home as a sanctuary rather than a showcase. Chandler helped me convert her study into a scholarship foundation office. Using income from the restored trust fund, we established the Evelyn Phillips Memorial Scholarship for first-generation college students pursuing mathematics education. The foundation would ensure that my mother's legacy of teaching and learning continued long after both of us were gone. By autumn, the house had been completely transformed back into the peaceful refuge my mother had intended. I spent weekends there, tending the garden she had planted, reading in the chair where she had spent her final comfortable months, and feeling her presence in every carefully chosen detail. The house was no longer just property. It was proof that love, planning, and unwavering principles could triumph over greed, manipulation, and criminal intent. Scott was serving his 25-year sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Danbury, where he would remain until he was 87 years old. His appeals had been denied, his requests for sentence reduction rejected, his hopes of early release permanently extinguished. Meanwhile, the home he had tried to steal flourished under the care of people who understood its true value. Justice had not only been served, it had been transformed into something beautiful, lasting, and worthy of the woman who had made it all possible.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.